Is Not a Drill, which is our weekly political education space for Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. We began doing this work when we were confined to our homes as a result of the coronavirus pandemic and the safer at home orders. We wanted to make sure that we could quickly get information to people about the particular way in which COVID-19 was affecting Black people. And as we did that work, we kind of saw this expand into an overarching political education space. So every Thursday night here at 7 o'clock, on Facebook Live. We are here talking about issues that are of particular interest and concern to Black folks and folks who say that they care about Black folks. Tonight's show is one that we pray that the ancestors are really present for. It is an honoring of our newly anointed ancestors, the Honorable Congressman John Lewis and the Honorable Reverend C.T. Vivian. And the conversation that we're hoping to have here tonight is with one of our most revered elders, Reverend James Lawson. And we're gonna be talking about both the spirits and work of John Lewis and C.T. Vivian, and also their work and their pledge and their praxis and theory around nonviolent direct action, a praxis and theory that's also held by current iterations of Black freedom struggle. Joining me in the conversation, along with the initial kind of space that we're providing to Reverend Lawson, is Pastor Eddie Anderson. Pastor Eddie Anderson is my brother from another mother. He is part of Clergy for Black Lives. He's the senior pastor, even though how old are you now? Are you 30?
I turned 30 in February.
Wow, so now you really grown, right? He's the senior pastor of McCarty Memorial Church, which is also often the physical home to Black Lives Matter. It's where we do a lot of our programming and events and meetings, and has really embraced and manifest the tradition of Black radical Christianity, a Christianity that is bound up in freedom struggle, not one that kind of only preaches about a spiritual God, but also about a God of justice. And so I'm grateful that Pastor Eddie Anderson is here and that he's my brother, because it's how we got Reverend Lawson to join us in the first place, is because he's also one of your mentors. So Pastor Anderson, Pastor Eddie, thank you for being here with us. And we're gonna bring you into the conversation. Do you wanna just offer a few words before, I see Reverend Lawson has just joined. Do you wanna offer just a few words before we wanna turn over the floor for the bulk of the hour to Pastor Lawson?
Well, I see Reverend Lawson is joining, so I'll give kudos to him and say, if you come to a Black Lives Matter meeting and you heard me say that we cannot dream in language of oppression, but we have to dream in language of freedom, that's a nod to Jim Lawson. Reverend Lawson has always stressed that to us, and to link our faith and spirituality together. So I'm excited for this conversation. I'm thankful to my sister, Melina, for having me on, and for Rosalind to be here as well. And I look forward to talking about how we can be angelic troublemakers together.
Great. Great. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of my real sister since teenage years, right? Since I was 17, we've been tight. Now I'm giving it away because people also think that we're biological sisters, because my daughter looks more like Rosalind than she does like me. But I also want to welcome the Reverend Dr. Rosalind Satchel, who's going to join us for the later conversation that we have with Reverend Lawson. And Reverend Satchel, Dr. Satchel, was also she was mentored by Reverend C.T. Vivian. And so she's gonna speak both as a scholar and spiritual leader, but also as a student and mentee of Reverend C.T. Vivian. And it looks like we may have lost Reverend Lawson for Hopefully he'll come right back. Um, just so that you know, Rosalind, that they can see us constantly, because everybody who's on camera can be seen. And that's because we have joining us for the first time on This Is Not a Drill, our amazing ASL interpreters from Pro Bono Interpreters. Rory and Mac are here. So for anyone who needs interpretation, they have access to this amazing conversation as well. I'm gonna put y'all on the spot real quick, because you know this is what happens when the show is on Facebook Live, right? As we wait for Reverend Lawson to rejoin, I have been reading Congressman John Lewis and Reverend C.T. Vivian's work for the last several days, and there's several points that they make that strike me in particular. This is an honoring of them. I'm wondering if maybe, Dr. Satchel, we can start with you with just one teaching or quote or memory of C.T. Vivian, Reverend Vivian, that you can offer.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that Reverend Vivian was wonderful for, that they talked about during the funeral today, which was beautiful, was that he had a way of making everybody feel like he knew you personally and that you were special to him, and he remembered you, and he would call us sis, you know, the women, of course, brothers, we call brother, but for us, he'd be like, sis, yes, sis, that's good, sis. That's good work, sis. That's good thinking, sis. You know, he had a way of affirming us and making us feel so special, like we came up with something new. And he knew he had seen this stuff 1,000 times before, but it made us feel like we had something special to contribute. And one of the things, the question that he would ask that made me more certain than ever that we have something to contribute, he would say, oh, sis, all this is great. This is beautiful. But how is it serving people? And it was just the way he said it. It was like, how is it serving people? Now, sis, I'm glad you went to law school and I'm glad you went to seminary, but how is it serving people? So let's ask ourselves that tonight, both in this conversation and also in our mission and in our work. I think it's one of the most affirming things to just take a step back. And I have to ask myself sometimes when my students get on my nerves and I'm like, how is this serving people?
That's a great question. And since you dropped it, let me just add one more, because Dr. Satchel said, I'm glad you went to law school and I'm glad you went to seminary. And I'm going to also add, and I'm glad you earned a PhD, because you have every degree, you know, under the sun. So Reverend Dr. Esquire, right, is what we gonna call you.
It's yes. Extra kooky, right, yes.
Right, right. What about you, Pastor Eddie? What do you have? Is there a memory or a teaching or a quote? And I'm going to ask you to offer this on behalf of our newly anointed ancestor, Congressman John Lewis.
John Lewis, I remember him coming to Morehouse. I was a chapel assistant at Morehouse. I remember him coming and spending time with us. And you wouldn't know that he looked like a civil rights giant. He was so humble. He always had a smile on his face. It made you feel like you were important. And yes, he would tell us to get into good trouble, but I think it's just his presence, right? It's something about knowing that this man had been in jail, been beaten up, and yet there was not like a mean like bone in his body when he was around us. He just made us feel like you were sitting with your granddaddy or your uncle or something. And so that was what I remember about him. And I think that's a lesson for all of us around how do we continue to be freedom fighters, but never lose our humanity and our kindness and our love for one another, even as we get into good trouble.
Right. Good trouble, good trouble. And he called it also necessary trouble.
Necessary. I'm so glad you said that. I was thinking about that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, you know, not to submit to the system as we've been handed it, right? To make sure that we rebel. And I'm going to also offer One last quote in hopes that we get Reverend Lawson back on before I offer my John Lewis quote. I do have a C.T. Vivian quote that I wanted to uplift that I thought was especially important for the work that we do in Black Lives Matter. And to be clear, Pastor Eddie is one of the founding members of Clergy for Black Lives, is a part of Black Lives Matter. Reverend Dr. Satchel is also a part of Black Lives Matter. And so this work and this movement is made up of many, many people who come. I know that you all are used to seeing us. Y'all might be used to seeing me cuss out the police chief. Some of us are cusser outers. Some of us are reverends. Some of us are professors. Some of us are caregivers, care providers for our children. Some of us are bus drivers. Some of us are not currently employed. Some of us are recently released from jail and prison, right? We come in all forms. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we absolutely mean all Black Lives Matter, and that all Black people have a role to play in the leadership of our organization. And so I'm gonna lift up my favorite C.T. Vivian quote, which is this: people do not choose rebellion. It is forced upon them. Revolution is always an act of self-defense. Revolution is always an act of self-defense. And I love that, because when we think about Reverend Vivian, when we think about his work, he's often presented as someone who is a civil rights leader, as someone who is respectable. He has Reverend in front of his name. But he was an advocate. He defined himself as a revolutionary, as one who believed in rebellion, who believed that God's calling upon us is to fight for freedom with everything that we have in us, not to submit to oppressive forms, not to submit to oppressive systems, right? Rebellion becomes necessary because it's forced upon us, because unjust systems force us to rebel, and you cannot be heeding God's call if you submit to an oppressive system. And so that is my absolute favorite C.T. Vivian quote. I'd love to get some of your reflections on that quote, Dr. Satchel. You know I'm gonna call on you.
I know you are. I know you are. I think it's exactly who he was. That's exactly who he was. CT had a wonderful, and we only called him CT out of his presence. You know, Reverend Vivian.
Yes.
And I would call him Dr. Vivian. I'd always call him Dr. Vivian. He'd say, oh, you know, and he would call us Doc too. That was another thing. And a lot of the men he would call Doc more so than the sisters. But you know, he meant well. He would do it. So every once in a while he'd turn to me and he would say, oh, Doc, you know that's just honorary. And I'd be like, oh, but Dr. Vivian, you earned that better than anybody with any PhD. I mean, real talk. He earned his through blood, sweat, and tears, and he had the wisdom of the ages. He would say things like that to us, and we'd have to sit with it. You know, we are forced into rebellion. He would always say, yeah, you know, and see, this is where I come from, when I assert that nonviolence was a strategy, because that was what he taught me. He taught me that nonviolence is a way of life for some people, and for some people, it's a strategy. But in a movement, what is most important is to have multiple strategies working at one time. And that is so important when we are forced into rebellion in the way that we are. We can't just attack on one side in one way. We've got to go for everything at every angle. And with the type of evil that we're up against now, one thing that Reverend Vivian didn't play with was evil. He would kick people out if they were evil. He could look at people and say, that one's not right. And he would make a really clear assessment on, he had a discernment in him, and he would cast out evil, whether it was personified or not. And I think in that same spirit, this idea of revolt and rebellion is really important for us when we really assert that this is an uprising. These are not riots. 45 is lying. There are no riots happening. We are not rioting. We are rebelling. We are revolting. We are uprising. And that is very different. It is a democratic process, and you can't take people's constitutional rights away with federal agents snatching people off the street. We're not going to sit by and let that happen. So this is what I think Reverend Vivian was talking to. We have to fight back.
Indeed, indeed. I'm realizing that we launched into this conversation because we're waiting on Reverend Lawson to get on. But as we wait, we do have Dr. Rosalind Satchel on, who was a mentee of Reverend C.T. Vivian. And, sometimes we take for granted that people know who these giants are, that people know who Reverend Vivian is. But the truth is, because you're an educator, as am I, that when we receive students into our classrooms, they're often miseducated and have very limited knowledge around Black freedom struggle. And the reason I'm terming it Black freedom struggle and not the civil rights movement is because Reverend Lawson is always quick to correct folks that it wasn't just a civil rights movement. It's one point in the struggle for Black freedom. I'm wondering if you could give us the 60-second, 2-minute version of who Reverend C.T. Vivian is, recognizing that some people have been miseducated to believe that when we talk about the civil rights point in Black freedom struggle, they've been taught that it was only Martin Luther King who was the Messiah who came down and had an idea and everybody followed behind him like he was Gladys Knight and they were the Pips, right? When really, when we talk about Black freedom struggle, it's always been what Mama Ella Baker calls group-centered leadership, where all of us share responsibility for leadership. And so C.T. Vivian was a huge part of that struggle. Can you just offer for us who C.T. Vivian was and what his spirit represents for us now?
He was a continuum all to himself in a way. This man had energy out of this world, energy that was so positive, energy that was so powerful. Dr. King is often talked about in terms of his preaching and how eloquent his preaching was and how powerful his sermons were. But Dr. King said that Dr. Vivian was the country's best preacher. He said this was the best preacher he ever heard. This was a man of faith who grew up in Peoria, Illinois in 1940s. I think he was born in 47. Nope, he was born in 24. He was born a year before my father. He was born in 24. He started hitting his first demonstration in 1947. That's what it was, in Peoria, Illinois. And really did change the way that one protest, that one demonstration changed everything for him. And all the way to his 95th, this man was about justice. He was lucid till the end. And he was in his 70s when he mentored me. And it was only for a brief period, but he made a profound impact in my life. He was a statesman. He was a strategist. He was a justice warrior.
And in terms of organizations, he did work with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
He did, and he started the Nashville chapter of SCLC. And what we have to understand is that Dr. King was not on site. Dr. King was the spokesman. He was the person they put out front. But these older gentlemen often, like A. Philip Randolph, and Bayard Rustin, and those that whole crew, they were older. They had been trying to do this for years. A. Philip Randolph said he had been trying since 41 to do a march on Washington. So that's why the 63 march was so important to him. So it's important for us to kind of understand that these men were organizers and administrators and mentors and coaches and secretaries and making copies and doing everything, just like the women the women who were there too, who often did not get the notoriety and definitely did not get the type of position and prestige and power. But they were there and they were all doing the top level work and the bottom level work. Everybody did everything because it was for the movement. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about everybody getting their name up in lights.
Well, now everybody should have been doing everything, but we also know Mama Ella Baker, that was part of the conflict, right? So, you know, when we talk about, of course, there were some who were more enlightened, but many of the ministers were critiqued by women like Diane Nash and Septima Clark and Mama Ella Baker for not wanting to, for feeling like, you know, these systems of patriarchy needed to exist even in Black freedom struggle. And so you saw kind of a pushback against some of that patriarchy, but you're right that everybody couldn't do everything, right? And so Dr. King was absolutely the spokesperson. However, many would say he was not a very strong organizer, right? So the organizing was Ella Baker and C.T. Vivian and many others, right? The youth energy was people like John Lewis, and the willingness to really pull people in rested with them, right? And so I think that that's really important to uplift. We're still trying to get Reverend Lawson on the line, but one of the questions that's coming up on Facebook, and if you're watching on Facebook, please feel free to drop questions in the comments, and those are being forwarded to us. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments. Pastor Eddie is back, and I think that this question that was dropped on Facebook, were we able to get through to Reverend Lawson, Pastor Eddie?
I got him on the phone, but it was a little unclear. So we're still trying to figure out what's going on with him.
Well, that's what happens with technology. If we were in person, we wouldn't have a problem, right? But
yeah,
we'll see if we can get Reverend Lawson, who is now, does he share his age? He shares his age, right?
Yeah, he shares his age.
91 years old, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he's 92, actually.
Oh, okay. 92 years old. If he can get on Facebook, that is amazing, right? So we would love to, and it's a Zoom to Facebook, so it's even extra complicated, right?
Yeah.
The questions that's coming up in the comments, Pastor Eddie, is the role of the church, right? And so we were just talking about C.T. Vivian and the willingness of leaders during the civil rights period of Black freedom struggle to draw from kind of a radical view of Christianity, that Christianity is not just about, you know, getting to heaven, but also about creating justice on earth, right? And so what do you see as the possibilities of pulling Christian pastors and leaders into this racial and social justice work, especially in this moment, in this movement moment, which is absolutely a Black Lives Matter moment?
Yeah, I think churches, if pastors lean into the moment, I think they were actually leaning into their true calling, their full calling, which is to overthrow systems that have oppressed their people. This is what Jesus did, right? Jesus' ministry starts with him saying, the Spirit of the Lord is upon him to bring good news and release the captives, to set people who are oppressed free. And it ends with him throwing over tables, right? Throwing over tables and saying, history is being made because you have defiled my people, you have oppressed my people. And so the church role is to do that, be that prophetic voice, to really tell the signs of the times, to let people know that we will not stand silent when oppression is upon our people. When the foot of the oppressor is on our neck, we will fight it off, right? That is what our sacred duty is as church people, right? That's what it means to have faith, right? Faith without works is dead, right? Jesus is casting out demons. Why? Because demons are holding people and tormenting people. We have a demon of white supremacy, of police brutality, of racism in our society. So that's the job we're supposed to be doing, right? And I'll remind folks when they're trying to get to heaven that Jesus' prayer is on earth as it is in heaven, which means we got to do some work here on earth to make sure the conditions are right for our people. So that's the role of the church. And I think all Black pastors, they know that in their DNA, right? If you are a Black pastor, by definition, well, not by definition, well, hopefully by definition, the Jesus that you are praying to and worshiping is a Jesus that got hung on a tree, got lynched on a tree, was raised from the dead, and said, all power in heaven and earth is in my hands, right? And that he is fighting as a person who was oppressed. If that's not your Jesus, then we need to talk about your theology and your hermeneutics. But that's the Jesus that made you, as a Black person, have value and worth. That's why you call him a doctor in the sick room, a lawyer in the courtroom, right? If Jesus is actually those things, then why aren't you living that out in your faith?
Indeed, indeed. And I think this is one of the reasons why you and Reverend Thomas and Pastor Q and Pastor Sauls and others, Pastor Smart, both Pastors Smart, initiated Clergy for Black Lives. Can you talk just a little bit about that work and what Clergy for Black Lives is?
Sure. Clergy for Black Lives is really reclaiming the narrative around Black faith, right? That for so long we've married the church with power and policies that may not have always been in the best interest of our people. And so the question people have always asked is, where the church at? What's going on in the movement? And we're demonstrating for people that we unequivocally support the movement for Black lives, that as the faith community does not mean that we have to lead the movement, but we have to be a part of the movement. We have to support the movement. And so we are reclaiming and denouncing white supremacy. We are unequivocally saying Black Lives Matter. We're unequivocally saying that God is on the side of the oppressed. And because we've been in this work and on the streets, right? Jesus does not preach in temples. Let's just keep that clear, right? Jesus is always on the street. You could read the Bible. There's like 4 times Jesus is in a temple. The rest of the time, he's on the street with the people doing the work. And so we at Clergy for Black Lives are saying we're on the street doing the work and following Jesus in that way.
Indeed, indeed. We appreciate that. We appreciate the pulling of clergy into the work, but also the opening up of space. One of the things that we've seen in recent years is we used to only have McCarty to go to, right? But we're seeing people open up their churches. People recognize that that should be a site for liberation work, not just a site for prayer, right? I do want to get to this question of respectability politics, because I feel like the role of having clergy involved in Black radical struggle, kind of one of the questions that's come up as we try to bring in some more traditional pastors. So you've been on the streets from the beginning, right? Pastor Q is church without walls. He understands the importance of being on the streets, right? James Thomas, can't nobody expect James Thomas to be quiet, right? He's been talking like this. The Smarts have been talking like this, right? But when we talk about more traditional pastors who have, I think in recent years, and I'll say that from the 80s onward, have been conditioned to believe that that their work needs to be work that's kind of confined to holy work, right? Things, they've been almost pitted against the radical folks, the folks, and by radical, I mean getting to the root of things, right? I mean, those of us who are committed to transformative work, not just reformist work, we've been pitted against each other. And what they've used often is this idea that you can say Black Lives Matter and believe in the message of ending state-sanctioned violence against Black people, while condemning what we use, which is disruptive tactics, right? We believe in Black Lives Matter that you cannot simply submit to the system and then ask the system to free us, right? Because the system will never do that. You have to demand it. One of Baba Akili's favorite quotes is Frederick Douglass, right? Power concedes nothing without demand. What we've seen in recent years, and I think part of this is through your work, is a willingness of some pastors to begin to interrogate that false divide between spiritual work and revolutionary work. The best spiritual work should be revolutionary, and the best revolutionary work should be spiritual. And so, can you talk a little bit about how we push back against respectability politics, and I'll go to you first, Dr. Satchel. They try to lift up when we talk about people like Congressman Lewis or people like Reverend Vivian, this ascription to nonviolence. But what they're leaving off, and you know, this is my favorite thing to teach, right, is on movements. What they're leaving off is there was never a praxis that was solely of nonviolence, right? Reverend Lawson will tell us this, who's considered, Dr. King called him the best teacher of nonviolent, and let me underscore this, nonviolent direct action in the nation, the best teacher of nonviolent direct action in the nation. And we often erase those last two words, direct action. Direct action absolutely means disruption. Can you talk about that and talk about maybe the need to reclaim those last two words as we struggle for justice?
Yeah.
Oh, which one? I'm sorry. Okay. You go ahead, Pastor Eddie. It's fine.
That's Reverend Lawson. That's the man himself. You spoke him up. You called him in.
Oh, right. It's Pastor.
I'm so sorry to be late. So sorry to be late.
Reverend Lawson?
Yes.
So sorry to be late. I don't see my picture up here yet, but
I think there's a little camera that should be in the bottom left of your screen.
Where's mine?
Right, it's the second, if you bring your cursor down.
Start video.
Yes, start video, that's the one.
That one? I think that's it, I'm not sure.
If you click on start video, it should start you. We should be
video, start.
Oop, you clicked mute, so let's unmute you. So not the microphone.
The other one. Next.
Unmuted.
Now click the one right next to it.
Come up here when it's ready to go.
Right next to
host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, but it's not screen share that we're clicking, it's start video. So if you look,
make sure that
right,
the powered on is connected to your computer. It should be.
We can hear each other.
If we're not able to get the video going, we'll take your voice if that's all you can get.
Okay.
And I'll ask our tech folks, Philip and Megan, if there's any way to, I don't think there's a way to start his video or prompt him to start his video, but if there is, if you
start video.
Zoom is unable to detect the camera. Make sure that your camera is powered on. Okay, I have to do something. All right, go ahead and start now.
Okay, Reverend Lawson, we're so grateful to have you on. We're so grateful that you joined us. It was just a call that happened 2 nights ago, and we're grateful to Pastor Eddie for connecting us. Thank you for being here, and we've been having a pretty robust conversation around Reverend C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis. And I know that we just talked about how Dr. King called you the best teacher of nonviolent direct action in America. And you were a teacher. And one of the things, and you are a teacher, you continue to do these nonviolence workshops here in Los Angeles. I've been privileged to attend some of your workshops. One of the things that I just lifted up before you joined is that when folks talk about nonviolence, I think that we often see them erase the last 2 words, which is you taught nonviolent direct action, not nonviolence as in being quiet and passive and accept the world as you've been handed it, but to challenge oppressive systems in a nonviolent way. And I'm wondering if you can just expand on that teaching, on that belief, and on that practice.
All right, can you all hear me okay?
We can hear you great.
Okay. Well, somehow we're not getting through with the picture, but well, thank you, Professor Abdullah. I appreciate very much being on this town hall with you. I apologize because at the last moment, Cornel West and Mark Ridley Thomas called, and so we're having a conversation which we're going to continue tomorrow about some of the scenes right now. So that's made me very late. But in any case, Cornel West and Mark and I have been friends since early 1980s. And we haven't had this kind of conversation for a while, so we are trying to figure out what's going on in our country. All right, let me try to begin very quickly by saying that the science of nonviolent struggle and the gathering of nonviolent theory and practice only began in the 20th century, around the same time that Albert Einstein was working on his equations on understanding gravity and force in the universe. Well, Gandhi was doing the same thing with resisting South African oppression of Indian people in South Africa around 1906 till about 1914, and he experimented with what he called nonviolence, and later what he called satyagraha. Pacifism in Western Christianity or in Christianity is not the same thing as nonviolent struggle in theory and practice. Pacifism is not necessarily supposed to be about passive. Nonviolent struggle is about how you change injustice, how you make personal and social change without imitating the evil you are against, which is very important. Gandhi, one of Gandhi's simple statements way back was, if you do an eye for an eye, of course, that's in the Bible. If you do an eye for eye, very soon everyone's going to be blind. Very soon everyone will be toothless. You cannot overcome wrong with more wrong. You cannot overcome evil with more evil. That's in the poetry and the language of the ancient world. Some of it's in scripture, but some of it is in simply the literature of the past. So nonviolence, as I came to read about it and understand it and practice it in the 40s, the 1940s, is a whole new social science intervention in Western and Eastern literature. I have not found any place where this term nonviolence has been used to speak about social struggle against wrong, against injustice and cruelty. So that's a brief kind of introduction to where I come from. So for me, nonviolence is the science of how you bring about personal and political economic change in the world. How you do it where you are, where you live and work, and how it can be done. And we now have books which we did not have in the 60s. One book, for an example, by a scholar from Ohio and Harvard and the University of Norway, Gene Sharp. He's now deceased, but he wrote a book called The Politics of Nonviolent Action. In that book, he collected some 198 tactics and methods that human beings have used from the beginning of history. So he collected them from his lifetime of research, 198. In the 60s, we added another good 20 tactics and methods that can be used. And that, of course, the march that we see so effective across the country today in over 700 cities, of course, the march is one of those tactics in the history of nonviolent struggle.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, and one of my greatest memories of Congressman Lewis is a new memory, right? So in 2017, I got to look it up. It was either 2017 or 2016 when he was here in Los Angeles, and he spent a little over a day with Black Lives Matter organizers. And one of the things that we had an opportunity to talk about, that I spoke with him about, was this notion of respectability politics. And at the time, many folks were talking about how, you know, in the civil rights era of the Black freedom struggle, they never would have shut down a freeway. These tactics are just problematic. I don't have a problem saying Black Lives Matter, but I disagree with their tactics. And what Congressman Lewis said to me was, what did you think happened during the march on Edmund Pettus Bridge? Do you think that when we marched, no traffic was forced to stop? And so what he lifted up was this idea, and he was your student, right? This idea of nonviolence does not mean that we simply submit. It doesn't mean that we don't disrupt. I'm wondering if you can, one, offer your reflections on John Lewis's sentiment, because he was very encouraging. He said for us to keep doing what we're doing, and said that our tactics were exactly the same tactics as the ones that they used during the civil rights movement. So he was very encouraging and refused to give in to that idea that there's some generational divide and somehow we lost our minds by, you know, shutting down a freeway. So I'm wondering if you can offer your reflections on that, but also your reflections on who was John Lewis as your student, and as one who you really trained to practice nonviolent direct action.
Well, I'm very glad to learn of that experience. John Lewis was a student in Nashville the same year that I went to Nashville to work for the Fellowship of Reconciliation across the South. Martin Luther King Jr. and I shook hands on February the 6th, 1957, shortly after the Montgomery bus boycott had ended in Montgomery, Alabama, and was a major reason for me to drop out of grad school. And then I selected Nashville as a place where I would live and work out of Nashville. I think John's observation, as you've told me, is quite true. And the way I tried to put it in the 60s or 50s and 60s was that nonviolence very often does interrupt and intervene, does change the agenda. That's a major part of the task. And I have never applied certain descriptions to the task, to this process, but always nonviolent action and work in the 60s, we interrupted the business community, the political community. We put our agenda on the table, whether it was city council or whether it was just the police or whether it was the business organizations we were trying to change. So nonviolent action is not passivity. It is not acting as though you are not a human being with all the juices of life in you. It is rather disagreeing with the use of power that is violent power, which what racism is. It is disagreeing with the agenda of injustice and organizing diligently to change it. So in campaign after campaign in which we participated, John Lewis and I, the 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, we were always intervening in such a fashion that the issue, whatever it was, had to be examined from another side and had to be examined from our Black side of change, our demand of dismantling the wrong and allowing new agendas to emerge. So I would make that issue. Nonviolence always makes people uncomfortable. I don't remember any time where our movements were simple, whether it was a strike or the sit-in campaign or the Freedom Ride or the St. Augustine, Florida campaign to desegregate public life. I don't know any campaign that did not make the press uneasy and cause political figures of all kinds to be very cautious, if not hostile, towards the campaign. And I would say to you, among other things, that what I see, and for the first 6, 8, 9 weeks, I have tried to follow it around the country, reading and looking at television, watching the demonstrations. This is the largest, most impactful nonviolent campaign that the country has ever had. And I'm impressed by the fact that you used caring for the families of the people who have been murdered by the police or executed by the police is a term I often use. Making that the strategic issue around which you organize is a mark of real genius and power. And that's extremely important to me as I watch it, and because I do continue. I am still a student of this whole business of social justice and social change. So the first thing I would say is that many of our campaigns were not considered respectful. They upset the public order. They upset law and order in so many different ways, so that disruption, interruption, intervention is a part of the work of nonviolent struggle.
Indeed. So those words I know mean the world to us. I'm watching Dr. Satchel and Pastor Eddie.
Thank you so much, Reverend Lawson, for clarifying, because this is where they hammer us. Thank you. I'm sorry.
The issue is not passivity. Nonviolence is not passive. It is, well, okay. Gandhi said that the first step towards a nonviolent movement was investigation. Examine carefully the issue itself. And when I adapted the Gandhian methods in the South, I used the term focus. Nonviolence is first focus. Focus on the issues and become the people who know the issue probably better than anyone else knows it. And be ready to suggest the solutions that can change the problem. Because those who perpetrate the injustice do not know how to solve it. They have to have help
Right. That's right.
again and again.
That's right.
And so we who do the organizing for a campaign must be prepared to have enough understanding of the problem that we can see the ways that can change the problem towards truth and justice.
Indeed, indeed.
So-
I'd love to bring Pastor Eddie into this conversation.
Sure. Yeah. So Reverend Lawson, one thing that you've always talked to me about, and I would love for you to share here, is about linking our faith and spirituality together in this fight against racism and oppression. And I would love for you just to talk a little bit to the people here in BLM and across Los Angeles around why is it so important for us to use our faith, or as you may say, our soul force, to right the wrongs of oppression.
Because primarily, my understanding of religious faith is that faith is about the journey you assume when you recognize that your life is a precious gift from creation, as the Declaration of Independence says, and that life must be cultivated. The ancients in the Hebrew world called the soul life. They also said you had a heart where there could be understanding and an awareness of your environment and awareness of your neighbor. They also said that you had a mind that had to be informed, could investigate, understand, and come up with ways for change. So, in fact, I'm working right now on a sermon from Jesus of Nazareth, where he said that the primary law of life is you shall love God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind and all your strength. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I think that is the critical and zenith teaching of the Hebrew Christian scriptures. Though the churches go off in all kinds of directions, in my mind, nevertheless, that's a maxim. That means all our lives we have to do homework on cultivating this life, nurturing this life, tapping the potential. It means that we have to be students, and I call myself a student of nonviolence, and have tried to learn as much about it as I can, whether in Africa or Asia or Europe, which I did very well, very much of in the 40s and 50s into the 60s. So does that touch the question, Eddie? So nobody is without the responsibility of cultivating their inward life, heart, mind, soul, whatever you want to call it, character, capacity to be alive. It does not happen without the person contributing to it and making it happen.
Right, so I guess I will ask you, what would you say to the Black pastors or Black religious leaders?
To what?
What would you say to the Black pastors or Black religious leaders who choose to stay on the sideline during the fight for justice?
Christianity needs radical transformation and revolution.
Mm.
Many Black pastors, like white pastors and Hispanic pastors in the United States, have taken on a kind of a creedal interpretation of Jesus, and they have not given their attention to the Jesus we have in the 4 books that we have written, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, which are the only 4 books from the ancient world that we have about Jesus. But that's more books than about almost anybody else in the human history from that period of time. So I would say that Black pastors and white pastors and all kinds of pastors become conventional people in this society and have failed to tap the fact that human life is a massive gift and that it has potential that we human beings have not tapped. And racism is one of the forces that have caused many human beings to diminish the gift of life rather than learning from it and cultivating it. So with Black Lives Matter, I do not see how any pastor can be an authentic pastor in the Black community and not recognize that Black Lives Matter is another evolutionary push out of the Black community for the justice that we need. We could not have done this in the 60s. I mean, I will say that the work of the 60s was different from what it is today. And I see that that this campaign has interrupted life all around the country now. And as I said earlier, it's in more than 700 cities. Well, the only thing comparable to that would have been the strikes and the boycotts in the 30s and 40s that formed the labor unions, out of which came the labor movement. So I see it as enormously important. Black pastors, Black sociologists, and Black scholars and academics need to get into the mix because we need to change America. One of the things that troubles me, and I think I've said this to Eddie Anderson, the Pew Center on American Life said a few years ago from one of their studies that 67% of the people of the United States think the earth is only 4,000 to 6,000 years old. That's because in the 17th century, a couple priests in England claimed that they had taken the words of the Bible and connected it up to years and centuries and figured out that the earth was only 4,000 to 6,000 years old. But the anthropologists, the zoologists, the astronomers, the physicists know that the earth is billions of years old, 5, perhaps 3 to 5. We also know that the universe is 13 to 15 billion years old. But so often in the United States, because of sexism and racism, I say, also because of violence, but in large ways because of plantation capitalism, we have lowered the opportunity of this country to become the kind of country it can become. And we have allowed many, many people to take on poisons in their lives, which keep them from appreciating themselves and from enjoying the richness of what it is to be a human being. And Black Lives Movement at this moment, I think, is pushing us in ways that we need to be pushed.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask Reverend Satchel to get in and ask a quick question. We're coming up on the end of our time. So I'm going to ask Reverend Satchel to ask a quick question, and then I'll ask one more closing question, Reverend Lawson.
Reverend Lawson, thank you again for being with us. There's often a mistelling of history that erases Black women from the civil rights movement. And I know of Diane Nash, and I know that there were other powerful sisters who were among your students. And I'm wondering if you could please set the record straight on the role of women in your teaching and your experience of teaching women in the movement, and also just how those women were treated, whether they operated in leadership roles, and why and when they didn't. However you'd like to address that, if you could please clarify on the role of women in the movement.
Well, as I teach I do not teach the length and breadth of the civil rights movement, because I think that's the USA term for broad sweep of history in our country. What happened in the 60s was that the NAACP started a legal strategy to deconstitutionalize every form of racism, which they did very beautifully. At the same time, when they, back in the 20s and 30s, they were pushing voter registration. The Montgomery bus boycott came about because Black women had started talking about the hostile treatment that they received on the buses in the early 50s. And that's what culminated in the bus boycott. It was a Black professor from Alabama State in Montgomery, Mary Jo Robinson, who, when Rosa Parks was arrested, immediately went into the basement of the administration building began the work of typing the leaflet calling for the bus boycott on Monday. And she and a small group cut 8 by 11 sheets in half and did some 30,000 printing of these things all night, December the 1st, and distributed them Saturday and Sunday then. So Black women were the major reason for the launching of the bus boycott. Many of them did come to prominence in Montgomery and around the southern region. The campaign, Nashville campaign of 1958, 59, 60 was largely suggested and demanded by Black women, who said in our meetings as we were planning a campaign in Nashville that would look like Montgomery, Alabama, which is what my purpose was. It was Black women to our meetings, our weekly meetings. We met for 6 months to decide upon our target and our demands. And it was Black women who said, we need to just desegregate downtown Nashville. Well, as a young organizer, I was unaware of what we could do, how we would do it. I was only committed to doing something, to creating a campaign like Montgomery that would show the nation that this could be done from the grassroots up. And as I say, I did not know what to do, except I knew a little bit about how to do it from studying nonviolent movements in other parts of the world and in the United States. So it was Black women in the Nashville process that said, let us go after stopping the public hostility of downtown Nashville directed at Black people. You cannot eat downtown. You cannot try on a pair of shoes for your children downtown. You can't try on a hat. You have to buy everything at face value, and then oftentimes you have real difficulty taking something back to be exchanged because the store didn't want it to exchange it, and so forth and so on. And women were very prominent from the very, very beginning. Right. Now, the media, of course, is another thing, and sometimes we go by the dictates of the media.
Yes. Reverend Lawson, we're coming up, well, we're actually beyond time, but I did have one more piece.
So in any case, what I want to say is that Black Lives Matter is changing that, because the people who speak in different parts of the country in these demonstrations are Black women.
Indeed, indeed.
So that will help to change it.
Thank you. I have one more piece I'd love to have a quick response from you on, and we want to close out with this. This is from John Lewis, and it made me think of you. He said, our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime.
Mhm.
Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble,
Yes.
necessary trouble. And so
Yeah.
we're so grateful to you for having dedicated your entire life to the struggle for freedom of our people, the freedom of our people. And we wonder if you can just leave us with a little bit about how you've been able to do this. What compels you to dedicate your entire life to this work?
Well, it's a large, huge question,
Yes.
but I
Have
can.
about a minute to answer it.
Okay, I will say as quickly as I can. I've been fighting racism since age 4.
Mm,
I've learned to fight it through the eyes of Jesus, because Jesus insists that the human life, is the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And that if we cultivate that gift of life, we will be astonished at what life can become. So I've been fighting racism for 87 years, and I'm grateful, because fighting that evil in our country, which is still not done by any means, is a lifetime and a generational task. And I'm really down deep in my life quite grateful that I've been able to be engaged in so many different ways in resisting this stuff. And I applaud Black Lives Matter for the last 10 years of very good organizing, which has resulted in the present campaigns across the country. And you've already accomplished a great deal, but it's a great deal yet to be done.
indeed. Well, we are so grateful to you. We're so grateful for your example, for your modeling, for your teachings, for your mentorship, and for always being an encouragement to us. We want to give you your roses now. And if you were here, I would have roses for you. And we want to just say thank you. And we hope to continue to learn from you for many more years. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Reverend James Lawson. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Rosalind Satchel. Thank you to Pastor Eddie Anderson. This is not a drill. Please join us again every Thursday night at 7 o'clock, right here on Facebook Live. We again want to thank Pro Bono Interpreters for doing our signing tonight. And on the back end, we want to thank Megan and Philip for getting our tech stuff together. Please tune in to everything we're doing with Black Lives Matter at blmla.org or on our social media. And we hope to see you soon in the struggle. Peace,
Thank
y'all.
you, Dr.
Thank
Abdullah.
you all, and
Thank
same to
you.
you.
Thank
Continue
you.
to do the work.
Thank you. All right.